Hi guys, so I wanted to work through with you a game that I played today, which is it's one of those games where there's a real crux point that deserves deep calculation. And in this particular game, my opponent, I think, simply miscalculated or rushed at that key point and threw away the advantage of the game, went on to lose. So it's one of those amazing situations where it feels like a Quentin Tarantino movie, you know, when everyone's pointing a gun at everyone else, like in Reservoir Dogs or Pulp Fiction. And it really just makes you sit and think, okay, this could go horribly wrong or it could go my way. And let me take you through the process that I went through. So I played the Scandinavian defence, captures, modern variation, knight comes out, pawn comes out to defend, which is actually a mistake. d4 with the queen's pawn is actually the best move here, because this enables e6 and the Icelandic gambit. Accepts the gambit, which you pretty much need to do at that point, and then the bishop comes out. Now we have a completely open e-file and opportunities to deliver a discovered attack, maybe with a queen. So again, another pawn move. Then I put my queen in there. So now c4 at this point in time is a free capture because it comes with a discovered attack. And we're working our way up to around move 15, which is where the action starts. Okay, knight comes out. So white at this point, what is this, a 20-minute, is it a 20-minute game? Something like. So white comes out, he misses the fact that this pawn is on pre. So I capture the pawn with check, bishop comes in, and I simply retreat my bishop off to the edge of the board with the idea that maybe it's going to come in useful later if white fails to realise that this bishop is on this nice long diagonal here. Okay, white castles. I bring my knight out so that I can castle queenside. You'll notice here, and this is one of the things I like about this opening, and one of the things that I'm looking at a lot generally, is trying to keep my pawns in a tidy structure. White now has one horrible isolated pawn on the d-file, and I have my pawn structure is still very much intact. My two central pawns are off the board, but white has lost the c and the e pawn, leaving that isolated d pawn. White brings out his knight, and I castle queenside, which means that my rook is now lined up with the isolated pawn and with white's queen. So quite a comfortable position at this point in time, with both, there's nobody on the 4th or 5th rank. It's just now time to reorganise and think about how maybe we want to start an attack. White brings the rook over to to the completely open e-file. That's a very sensible move. And I bring my queen in. I want to take the queen out of the line of fire of the rook. That's one of my first considerations. I'm also conscious now that this dark squared bishop is now tied to the defense of the pawn on b2, and this pawn can't move because it's the only defender of that knight as well. So it's kind of a general purpose move. I haven't really got a specific idea in mind, but it just feels like it's improving the position of my queen. And the other consideration is that I want to get the queen out of the way of my dark squared bishop, because now that the king is over on that side of the board, on the king side of the board, I want to get this bishop maybe out here to c5, maybe b6, so that I've got then both bishops lined up along the longish horizontals towards that king. White decides to push my queen away. I move my queen back, and he comes out with a pin on the knight. I release the pin with my dark squared bishop, which it can now move, and white comes in with an attack on the queen. Now, this move the computer says was a blunder, Now I did also notice when this bishop was in the way here, that this pawn, if this pawn moved out to attack the queen, I could safely capture with my knight, because white can't recapture with a3. That would leave the rook undefended, and I could capture that with my queen. Now that white has moved his dark square bishop out, the queen is now defending the rook on a1. So white can play this move. So I thought for 48 seconds on this move, because I'm thinking, okay, I can capture with the knight. If white recaptures with a3, I capture the pawn with my queen. This knight isn't doing an extremely useful job at this point in time. It's in a defensive role, which is useful. And I would go effectively one pawn down with this exchange. I gain 2 pawns in return for a minor piece. The other thing that I'm maybe doing is giving this rook a bit more free rein to attack my king side. Okay, but on balance, I thought that it was worth going ahead with the exchange. I'd want to give my queen activity. Also, I'm aware that this bishop is only defended by the knight there on f3. Captures, and I recapture. And now comes the really key point of the game. Okay, so after I recapture, I didn't really think through very much at this point. I made my move in 1.7 seconds there. Okay, now white brings his dark squared bishop back with ideas of discovered attack on the queen, because that g5 attack down there was going nowhere. I think and he spent a minute and a half on this. Now I then think for 30 seconds and decide to capture this pawn. Because if you look back, the dark squared bishop has just moved in front of the queen. This pawn was defended by the queen and the bishop, and now that the dark squared bishop has moved in the way, the queen is no longer defending the pawn. So I have 2 attackers here and here on that pawn. So I figure I can go ahead and capture the pawn. I'm not too concerned about a discovered attack with the knight at this point, because I know my queen has got lots and lots of safe squares to move to. White recaptures with the bishop, and I go in and take with the rook. This is now pinning the dark squared bishop there on d2. And now this is where the fun really starts. So white then comes up with a really, really dangerous move. Knight to d5, and at this point all my alarm bells started going off. There's flashing lights, red lights everywhere, and I knew that this was a key moment in the game. So let's just have a look at what's going on with this move, and this is your Tarantino moment. So my queen is now under attack twice. So I've got the dark squared bishop there and the knight both attacking my queen. Clearly I'm going to have to do something with my queen. There's also a risk of knight takes the bishop on e7, which comes with check. My queen cannot recapture because that's defended by a rook. So I can't capture the rook with my rook because the queen is there on pre. Very messy situation. So I have to think carefully, and I have to calculate what's going to happen in each different scenario. So taking the knight is not an option because the queen falls. Taking the bishop, the queen falls. However, if I take the bishop, knight takes queen. So this is the thread that I'm starting to think. You need to consider every eventuality. I've got 20 minutes still on the clock. This is obviously a like 20 plus 15 or something game with an increment. So I've got plenty of time. and it's really, really important to notice when those key moments come when you've got to use your time. So if I just decide to move my queen somewhere safe, say here to c5, then I can expect the knight to come in and capture e7 with check, and I've lost a piece. I can't recapture that. So then I'm starting to think, okay, what about this rook takes bishop? So if rook takes bishop, that comes with an attack on white's queen. Okay, so and then this is where you have to start almost counting. Rook takes bishop. Okay, so I'm up 3. Then knight takes my queen, so I'm going to be down 6. Then my rook takes white's queen, so I'm up 3 again. And so I'm up 3, then what happens? So white can then take my rook, so he's up 2, but then I've got the possibility of recapturing the bishop or the knight or whatever, or the knight with my bishop. Okay, so let's see how it actually pans out. I decide that this is safe enough to go forward. But this is, again, is where, so I've spent a lot of time on thinking this through. White does not. So in fact, what I do is I go for the knight capture first. Okay. So I take the knight, and I realize here that my queen is still on pre. The bishop can take the queen, but if the bishop does, then I can go ahead and capture. Right, bishop takes queen, rook takes queen, and now this is a key point. So white spends 30 seconds on this next move, but should, I think, have taken longer. So let's think this one through. The situation is right now that I am up 3 pawns. Okay, I have these 3 pawns on this side of the board that white doesn't have, otherwise we are equal. Now, what I think white should have done in this situation is captured with the rook on A. This knight is the only defender of the bishop there. This knight is also attacking that bishop there. Okay, now if white had recaptured with this rook, then he's going slightly ahead in material. If I capture the bishop, I lose my bishop. Okay. Now, what white does is capture with the bishop, but that allows me to take the rook. The other rook is now pinned, so can't even defend the bishop. He has to recapture, and I recapture with the knight. Okay. Now let's see what would have happened the other way round if that rook had taken. I think this is a better situation for white. So rook takes. If I take the bishop, then I lose my bishop. So now I think there white should be 1 rook up. And he's got 17, nearly 18 minutes on the clock, should have taken time. And this is those key points where there are lots of options, and it really, really is worth taking your time to evaluate those options. In the end, he made the wrong move, rushed it, managed to get a pawn back here, but the end game is relatively straightforward. I have 2 pawns advantage, I just need to make it stick. So let's go through relatively quickly. I want to mobilize my king, use my king to shepherd these 2 pawns up to the first rank and queen. White engages his knight, which is a good move. I threaten the exchange, which is only going to help me. This is where I make a blunder, actually. I decide to keep the pressure on, and I fail to realise that white now has 2 attackers on b6. So he captures with the rook. I have to move. Attacks rook, moves away, attacking pawn. I put pressure on the rook. So here I'm just trying to keep the pressure, and also I want to make sure that my rook can keep his king quartered in that area of the board, whereas because kings are very, very powerful in the endgame. I want my king to be involved in this pawn queen attempt. I don't want his king involved. Okay, so brings back again. I threaten the exchange. He goes for the exchange, and then he grabs a pawn. So we are actually equal in material here, but now it's a foot race. Bring my knight in, because I really want my knight covering some of those squares. King comes in, knight comes in to help the attack. Again, this is another very, very key area of the game. I still have 20 minutes on the clock. White still has just under 18 minutes on the clock, so there's plenty of time to think. I go in with a check on the king, come back, and I'm starting to worry now. Maybe this is like a drawish kind of situation. I move the pawn in because I realise the pawn is now defended by the knight and the king. So if knight captures, my knight takes his knight, and I should be in a strong position there. He decides to push a pawn up. I deliver check. Now the king obviously can't take the pawn, so very often I'm thinking, okay, where can the king go? Can't go there, can't go there, can't go there. He only has one move to here, and then I can queen. Okay, and the rest of the game went pretty straightforward. You know, all I have to do is keep the pressure on. So this was an interesting move. I realised that if I push the pawn, white can take, but if he does, I can take f3, and I think that should be winning because now g4 is also going to fall. So there, g4 falls, comes in with check, and obviously at this point in the game, whenever there's a knight left on the board, you just always have to be looking out for those potential forks. It's horrible to be well up in material and then blunder your queen because you've left your queen and king on the wrong coloured squares. So here, if you notice, when the knight is moving around, when the knight, for example, now is on a light square, I want to put my pieces on dark squares, and obviously not where the knight can capture them, because if I try and keep my pieces on dark squares, then I know that knight, because a knight always has to change colour every time it moves. So if it's on a light coloured square and it moves, it's always going to land on a dark coloured square, which means it's only going to be attacking light coloured squares. Okay, so just one handy thing to bear in mind: when there's a knight left on the board in the endgame, if you try and keep your pieces on the opposite colour, and obviously where they can't be taken, then that knight cannot move, make one jump and attack your pieces. So this is the end of the game. Does the capture, I capture, take that one, comes in with check, and that's checkmate. Okay, so it really all does come down to those key points in a game, and you can get these extremely sharp situations. Just take your time. Play these longer time controls where you can afford to take time. That's where chess games are so often won and lost. That's where the balance is tipped. So give yourself time by playing longer time controls. Take your time when it matters. Invest those precious minutes and start to get into the habit of winning these situations. Then your chess will just get so much better. See you.